I want to start by saying some really nice things about the book, which I really enjoyed reading. But I'll start off with a small anecdote. So for some context, I knew about Paul's work because I went to Boston University and Paul is a lecturer there. And I heard about this new book, The Philosophy of Devotion, which I thought would be really interesting for the philosopher. And I started reading the first chapter with the intention of finding a suitable interlocutor to talk to Paul about the work. And I read chapter 1, and then Paul kind of ends on a cliffhanger, and then I read chapter 2, and then chapter 3, and lo and behold, I've now read the entire book, and I decided to sign myself up for the role. But that is to say that not only is this book really philosophically thorough, it's also a really enjoyable read. Paul has a lot of examples, again, to kind of guide us through this philosophy. So I would highly recommend that people kind of check out the book if they like some of the things we're going to talk about today. And I think the best thing about the book is that it's not just making kind of a minor contribution to a small subfield. It really is aiming to reframe the way we think about some of the most fundamental kind of ideas in philosophy, such as values and how we rank them, which is kind of core to ethics and political philosophy. So kind of with that in mind, and again, kind of having sold the book, I want to ask Paul to kind of ease us into some of the discussion by talking about what sacred values are, how they're different from ordinary values, and what role they play in our ethical life.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about sacred values. So one of the ideas that I talk about in the book is something that I think is quite intuitive, but also a little bit hard to make sense of. So if you think about all of the things that we call our values, I might say that I value having a cup of coffee or going for a walk. These are relatively trivial things. I do value them. It seems right to describe them as things that I value, but they seem very different from some of the values that might seem to be like deeper constituents of my identity, that might seem to be much more important to me. Things like the political values that I endorse, the value I place on philosophy, the value I place on things like justice and so forth. So it seems like although we use the term value to refer to all of these things, there are some pretty significant differences between the respects in which I value something like justice and the respects in which I value something like a cup of coffee. And one way of trying to make sense of that difference is just by talking about the weights that those values have. So, you know, some philosophers think that really all you need to do to speak about all the values that people might have is to talk about the weights that they bear with respect to one another. So the value of justice for me is weightier than the value of coffee and so forth. Now, I think that's not quite right. I think there's a distinctive type of value that plays a really important but sort of underappreciated role in ethical life. And it's what some psychologists call sacred values. So the idea of a sacred value, there's some disputes about how exactly to characterize these things. So the interpretation that I offer is a particular way of characterizing what sacred values are, but there would be, you know, disagreements about this. But I think sacred values are values that have three special features. So one feature that sacred values have is that they're inviolable. So if you think about most values, there are going to be circumstances in which it makes sense to act against them or to violate them. So, you know, if I value coffee, there are plenty of times in which, despite the fact that I value it, I'm going to set it aside to do something else. But there are some values where the people who hold them will think it's prohibited or problematic to violate them in any circumstance, regardless of what's at stake. Now, there are also, so that's the first feature, inviolability. There's also a feature that I call incontestability. So there are some values that people feel reluctant even to contemplate violating or trading or sacrificing for other values. So let me give you an example of this. So, you know, an example of how sometimes it can seem problematic not just to actually violate values, but even to seriously contemplate violating them. So, you know, imagine I have like a rich relative and I seriously contemplate killing that person just to collect an inheritance or something like that. I mean, even if I never do it, even if I decide not to, the mere fact that I seriously contemplated that would seem really bad. It would seem objectionable, right? So that's a feature that some values have that I call incontestability, where there seems to be something wrong even with contemplating the violation of them. So the third feature then is what I call dialectical invulnerability. So this is the idea that most of our values are responsive to our thoughts about whether they're justified. So, if I come to think that coffee is tremendously unhealthy, or, that there's some good reason not to drink coffee, I think what would happen is that I'd give up that value, maybe with some reluctance, but I'd start to act differently. There are other values that seem unaffected by thoughts about their justification. So think about some core political values, some religious values, some values that are involved in people's sense of their identity, even some values that are involved in things like deep personal relationships. You might think that some of these values, to a greater or lesser extent, just resist the effects of critical reflection. Even if you come to think that these values are in some sense unwarranted, that's not going to budge how strong the value is for you. So just to sum up, so a sacred value would be one that has all three of those features to a high degree. It would be inviolable, incontestable, and dialectically invulnerable. And I think there are lots of values like that.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's really great about the first chapter and about the book in general is that you generally think these are sacred values that other people engage in. Like, these aren't features that all of us have because we're philosophers and we question all sorts of things. But what you're saying is this phenomena is quite broad, and you find this in almost all of us. And I was going to ask you to talk a bit more about the relationship between sacred values and devotion and our longing for it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're quite right that I do think that sacred values, although they're most obvious in certain kinds of political and religious contexts, I think they're actually quite pervasive. I think you see them in a lot of personal relationships, but I also think you see them, for example, in philosophers. Some of us have sort of favorite philosophers who we're at least extremely reluctant to think of as being wrong, where what might initially, or what might strike most people as a decisive objection to that philosopher, will strike you, the proponent of that philosopher, just as a confusion or as a reason for thinking more deeply about that philosopher's real thought or something like that. So one thing that I try to do is to give some cases in which, although it might not initially look like people are committed to sacred values, that nonetheless they show up upon further reflection. And one part of that is that just as there's this distinction between ordinary valuing and sacred valuing, I think there's something like that distinction that obtains with our commitments. So I think there's an ordinary form of commitment where I might be committed to something like going to the gym a certain number of times per week, or being on time for my office hours or things like that. But then I think there's also a sacralized version of commitment that has some of those same features, where one of the differences between ordinary commitment and this more robust form of commitment that I call devotion is that it's going to display that feature that I was calling dialectical invulnerability. So I think that most of our commitments are responsive to thoughts about their justification, to thoughts about whether they're warranted and so forth. But I think we have some commitments that are both impervious to that kind of reflection, and where we even actively try to maintain that kind of imperviousness to reflection. So personal relationships, I think, are sometimes like that. Loving relationships to a romantic partner or a child, I think, sometimes display that kind of feature. But also our commitments to certain projects that are involved in our conception of who we are, involved in our conception of our identities, I think sometimes display that feature. So one thing I try to do in the book is to offer an analysis of this phenomenon of devotion and talk about how that too is pervasive. And not just that it's pervasive, but that it plays a really important role in ethical and social life.
Yeah. And some of the things we've been talking about so far have been quite descriptive, and you've drawn quite a lot of psychological studies to kind of make this point of what sacred values are, what is devotion, how we're all kind of vulnerable to it. But that's not your end, right? You want to take us from that descriptive into the normative and ask questions about kind of what should we do about these things. And so I wanted to kind of ask you about what are ways in which sacred values can be helpful. And also maybe if you can tie that into some of your work on nihilism and what you mean by that.
Yeah, good. So I guess one reaction that you might have to the stuff I've been saying so far is that I've been talking about a kind of valuing that resists critical reflection, a kind of commitment that resists critical reflection. And like one reaction that you might have is basically to think that, sure, people do that, but that's a failing. You know, that's unfortunate. It's a pathology or something. It'd be better if we didn't do that. Um, I think that's wrong. So one thing that I try to do in the book is to argue that these two things, sacred values and devotion, actually play a really important role in sustaining certain kinds of ethical and social relationships, so that it would be a mistake to try to give them up or to move past them or get rid of them. Now, one of my, I give a couple of different kinds of arguments for that conclusion, but one of the arguments that you're mentioning is this argument about a form of nihilism. So nihilism is one of those terms where different philosophers mean different things by it. So some people just mean by nihilism the claim that life has no meaning or that there are no objective values or things like that. I focus on a different thing that sometimes is described as nihilism. So this is the idea, not so much that there aren't any values, but that there are too many values and that we lack a principled way of choosing between those values. So the kind of nihilism that I'm interested in is a kind of skepticism about our capacity to weight alternatives against one another. So that might sound a little mysterious, so let me give you a sense of what I mean there. I think that there are certain things that are valuable about being a philosopher. I think there are also plenty of things that are valuable about other forms of life. And I think there are things that are disvaluable about being a philosopher and about those other forms of life as well. So one thing you might worry about if you imagine yourself in the position of like deciding whether you should have a certain kind of career or what you should devote yourself to or how you want to spend your life, one thing you might worry about is not just whether you have reason to pursue one mode of life over another, but whether you have any principled way of ruling out one form of life being preferable to the one that you're engaged in. So you might think that if you're going to be a philosopher, that involves giving up all these other forms of life that have attractions that might seem quite valuable in their own right and so forth. So what you might want to do, I mean, what would be really nice is if you had some kind of argument establishing either that being a philosopher is sort of like objectively more valuable than these other things that you're giving up, or if not that, at least some argument showing that it's on par with those other things or not worse than those other things, at least from your own, given what you value and given what your desires are like and so forth. Now, one thing that I try to argue is that some people will resist this argument. It depends on how skeptical about our prospects for establishing sort of definitive and univocal moral conclusions we are. But I try to argue that there are reasons for thinking that even if we can show that any particular mode of life or any particular view of ethics or morality is like rationally justifiable, we are never in a position in which we can confidently rule out alternatives to those sorts of ethical theories, modes of life, things that you could devote your life to, and so forth. And I've been giving an example of how I might devote myself to being a philosopher or something else, but the same problem arises at the level of philosophical theory. Like if you're looking at different ethical theories, I might be attracted to Kantian ethical theory. I might think that although there are good arguments for being a Kantian, there are also lots of good arguments against it. And the arguments for being a Kantian are not like watertight. There are objections to them. So I might worry about whether I really have sufficient reason to be committed to that ethical theory rather than to some alternative ethical theory. Nihilism, in the variant that I'm interested in, is the claim that we don't, that we never, or at least almost never, have an acceptable degree of justification for ruling out certain kinds of alternatives, either to the ethical theories that we accept or to the modes of life that we commit ourselves to. And if that's right, what I try to argue is it has this interesting implication. It entails that if you thought that you should only be committed either to a mode of life or to a philosophical or ethical theory to the extent that you could sort of critically and rationally justify that theory, then it would entail that you never have reason for wholehearted commitment to any particular mode of life or any particular ethical theory. It would entail that you only have reason for a sort of less robust form of commitment to those things. But what I try to show in the book is that if we manifest these less robust forms of commitment, as opposed to the more wholehearted forms of commitment, either to modes of life or to ethical theories, then that has a lot of cost for us. Our commitments tend to dissipate. Our ability to achieve the goods that are internal to these practices tends to dissipate. So there are costs to the less robust forms of commitment to these things. And accordingly, there are reasons for manifesting the kind of commitment that I call devotion, which involves a certain degree of imperviousness to the kinds of rational considerations that I was just mentioning. So that's a little complicated, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Normative dissipation, right? When you can't kind of assign weights and you're left without something to devote yourself to.
Yeah.
So that's like a way in which sacred values and devotion can be helpful. But you also talk a lot about ways in which it can go wrong, and sometimes it can go very wrong. And so should we talk now about fanaticism and also the way in which you define it, which is in opposition to the way certain other Enlightenment philosophers have historically defined it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing I've been calling devotion, I think there's a sort of pathological or problematic form of it that comes out, for example, in fanaticism. So I spend part of the book talking about what fanaticism is. So if you just picture, if I say the word fanatic and something springs to mind, what's probably going to spring to mind is somebody who's extremely committed, wholeheartedly committed to some cause, whether it's a political cause or a religious cause, who's willing to make sacrifices, both of himself and of other people, for the sustenance or the achievement of that cause or that ideal. And maybe you'll think that the person's also going to be sort of closed-minded or irrational or have some kind of epistemic problem. So I think that's what we tend to associate with fanaticism. We tend to think that fanatics are these people who display an extreme degree of commitment to something and are willing to do things like engage in violence and social upheaval to achieve that thing or to maintain that thing, and who are also sort of too confident, or there's something epistemically wrong with their beliefs. They're sort of too certain, or they're irrational in some respect. I think that's what we typically associate with fanaticism. And fanaticism, it used to be a big topic of concern, for example, in the early modern period of philosophy. So if you look at people like Shaftesbury or Hume or Kant or Locke, a lot of others, these people are very concerned with offering an account of what fanaticism is. And we find an account in each of these people. So each of those people, each of these major thinkers, has a slightly different account of what fanaticism is. For example, Locke is, his account relies very heavily on some epistemic problems with the fanatic, whereas Kant's account is a little bit different than that. But I think there's a shared set of things that philosophers in the early modern and the Enlightenment period associate with fanaticism. And what that tends to be is basically that the fanatic is going to be somebody who has sacred values, so they're devoted to a certain kind of value or cause or ideal. And there's some sort of epistemic problem with these people. Now, I try to argue that while these Enlightenment era thinkers are picking out an interesting kind of character or an interesting sort of pathology, it's not the one that should be associated with fanaticism. So it's sort of a less problematic thing than fanaticism actually is that they're picking out. And you can see that, I mean, basically what I try to argue is that their account sort of fails even on their own terms, because what these people, at least most of them, what people like Locke and Rousseau and Shaftesbury and these others are trying to pick out is a kind of constellation of traits that leads to the sort of violent intolerance and social upheaval that we associate with fanatics. But I try to argue that the things that they're picking out don't really have any essential connection with those forms of violent intolerance. So I try to offer an alternative account of fanaticism, which ties fanaticism not just to having a sacred value, basically, but to having a sacred value for a certain reason, out of a certain kind of fragility, as I put it. So the idea here is that certain people who you might associate with fanatics cling to ideals in what I describe as a fragile way, in the sense that they feel that those ideals are under threat. They feel that the only way to secure the status of those ideals is by enforcing a kind of universal compliance with those ideals, and who accordingly are disposed to a certain kind of violent intolerance so as to respond to others who don't share those ideals. So one way of thinking about that is that there's a difference between the person who holds on to some ideal and perhaps is even like really devoted to that thing, is willing to do quite a bit to achieve it, and in certain contexts might even be willing to engage in coercive or violent activities so as to achieve that end. There's a difference between the person who does that because they genuinely just think that the thing is valuable and see real threats to the instantiation of that value. So for example, if I'm devoted to maintaining equality or something like that, and if we see threats to, like real threats to equality, we might think you've got to do stuff to ensure that those threats are handled, right? So there's a difference between somebody like that and the person whose commitment to the sacred value is motivated in this way, where the ideal is linked to their sense of identity and their identity is seen as under threat, not necessarily due to actual threats to the value, but due to the mere fact that other people don't accept the value or don't relate to the value in the same way that they do. So what I try to articulate in the chapters of the book on fanaticism is the way in which there can be a sort of brittle or fragile attachment to sacred values that motivates, or at least tends to motivate, a violent response to those who don't share the value. And it's that brittleness or that fragility that I think we should be associating with fanaticism. I try to show that, if you look at the people who are actually inclined to call fanatics, that's sort of a trait that we see in a lot of these individuals.
Yeah, so when we say we're a football fanatic, or for people who read my bio, when I say I'm a Taylor Swift fanatic,
Yeah,
very different from
I think so.
the way we're
Yeah.
actually defining fanaticism, which is again very important philosophically.
Yeah, so I think fanaticism is one of those terms where there are certain like paradigm fanatics, the core cases of fanaticism, but then there's this more metaphorical usage where when we call like a Swiftie a fanatic or whatever, all that we might mean by that, I think all we typically mean by that is that they're like really devoted to that it's a very important thing that overrides other concerns that they have and so forth. But I don't think that that's fanaticism in the most robust sense. I think the most robust form of fanaticism is the one that is tied to a certain kind of violent intolerance of those who don't share the relevant value or commitment or goal.
Yeah. And some of the work you talk about, again, reminds us of Qasim Qassam's work, who again, you acknowledge and you say you're in conversation with. And I just wanted to ask you about kind of how your work is in conversation with each other and ways in which you agree with him and ways in which you disagree.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So Qasim has this really interesting book on extremism. So the title's just Extremism. So he's been working on those topics for a while. And one of the parts of his account of extremism in the book, he has a chapter on fanaticism. So he and I agree that extremism is like a broader phenomenon than fanaticism. So not every extremist is going to be a fanatic, but there can be extremists who aren't fanatics. But it might be the case that every fanatic is going to be an extremist, although that's a little contentious. But we both agree that extremism is this broader thing, fanaticism is narrower. Now, Kasim and I disagree about what it takes to be a fanatic. One of the Oh, and I should say that Kasim also, he agrees with me that this, what I call the Enlightenment account of fanaticism, the one that I was attributing to people like Locke and Kant and so forth, that it's mistaken, that it's not really picking out full-fledged fanaticism. So we also agree on that. But the main point of disagreement, or at least one of them, is that this stuff that I was describing in terms of brittleness or fragility, Kasim thinks that that's not essential to fanaticism. So he has examples, for example, in his book, he says that my account can't be right because he has this example of a Nazi, a member of the Nazi party who does all these terrible things and who might look like a fanatic, but who doesn't have that kind of brittleness or fragility, if you look at the biographical details. I have a different reading of that case where I think that this person he's talking about is just not a fanatic. He's a person who does terrible things, and he's certainly an extremist, but not a fanatic. So there's that disagreement about whether fragility or brittleness is essential to the fanatic. But there's also a difference in that Kasim thinks that you have to build in a notion of the fanatic being committed to morally reprehensible ideals. So one disagreement that we have is that I think that you can be a fanatic and be directed toward good ideals, toward morally praiseworthy ideals, whereas Kasim thinks that that's impossible. So one way in which that dispute comes out is if you think about, for example, the abolitionists, the people who are trying to end slavery, for example, in the US or the British abolitionists and so forth, those people are committed to really great ideals, right? I mean, they're seeing a moral evil, slavery, and they're undertaking various sacrifices and being strongly devoted to abolishing this evil state of affairs. So it's a great end. Some of them, so if you look at the biographies, for example, John Brown is one person who I think is an interesting case. John Brown, if you don't, he's active in the US in the 19th century. He does things like killing, sometimes for example, he and his sons kill 5 people associated with slavery by like hacking them with swords and stuff. He also leads a revolt where he's, at least the purported thing that he's trying to do is to instigate a revolt that will overthrow the US government and thereby put us in a position to end slavery that way. So he leads a raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And, various people are killed in that. He looks very, at least a lot of the contemporary newspaper reports make him look like he shares some features with fanatics. He's at least very like monomaniacal and so forth. But he's devoted to a great end. And you might even think that it's not like he single-handedly brings about the end of slavery, but you might think he gives some push to that. So he's devoted toward a good end, and he might even help to bring about that really great end. So Kasim thinks that people like that, we can't call them fanatics because they're devoted to good, praiseworthy ends. Whereas I think that that's wrong. I think that you can be a fanatic while being devoted to something that's quite good, because I think that fanaticism is picking out something about the way in which the person relates to ideals and not something about the ideals or values themselves. So I don't think we should build into the notion of fanaticism the idea that it has to be directed toward these reprehensible ends.
Yeah, no, I think that's a key difference and really helpful. And you have some really interesting stuff about how individual fanaticism relates to group fanaticism.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could walk us through that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, just as we like to talk about individual fanatics, and you can find, clear cases of individual fanaticism, a lot of people think you can also talk about fanatical groups, right? So you might think that certain like political groups are fanatical, and so on. So just as we might talk about some individual being a fanatic, you might think, what does it take for a group to be fanatical? And you might think there are some very simple accounts, like maybe you would say that a group is fanatical just if like all of the members or most of the members are fanatical. I think that sort of thing doesn't work. I think there's a difference between a group's being fanatical and the members of the group being fanatical. So I ask what it takes for a group to be fanatical. And the account that I give is that a group can be fanatical, or the one thing that we ought to mean when we call a group fanatical is that it has this propensity to induce fanaticism in the members of that group. So it's sort of that like a group counts as fanatical if it turns you into a fanatic in virtue of your membership in the group. That's the core idea. And then there would be a question about how you would do that, right? So like, how do you take a person, get them into a group, and thereby like turn them into a fanatic, or at least make them more susceptible to being a fanatic? So I have some work that tries to address that question. And, like one of the mechanisms that I point to is one that I think is unfortunately like pretty pervasive nowadays. I think certain groups function by generating what I call narratives of resentment. So these narratives, I say a lot about them in the book, but to put it really simply, the core idea is that certain groups sort of portray an us-them dichotomy and present all of the problems facing the us, the in-group, as traceable to these out-groups, the them, right? And teach that what we need to do is have sort of like a hostile response to the out-group. So by fostering these us-them dichotomies and inducing an emotion that philosophism has called ressentiment, which is like a certain type of resentment, I try to argue that that's a way in which you can generate this brittle or fragile sense of self that I associate with fanaticism in the members of that group. So it's sort of that in virtue of accepting one of these things that I characterize as a narrative of resentment, what tends to happen to the person. I mean, this can be blocked in all sorts of ways. It's, psychologically complex, but one thing that can happen is that the person begins to display this fragile sense of self coupled with this hostile antagonistic relation to people who are perceived as being in the out group. So it's in that way that we can get groups sort of transforming or at least encouraging their members to be fanatical. And it's those groups that should count as fanatical. And then I think I try to show that you see that in a lot of like paradigmatically fanatical groups. So you see that, for example, I talk about some of the ISIS recruitment material. I talk about some of the white nationalist movements that have a very similar structure, where you see that what these people are being exposed to who join these groups is just that kind of story that I was calling a narrative of resentment, and you see the effects that it has on these people.
Yeah, no, I feel like we've covered a decent amount of ground, and we're 40 past the hour. But again, there's a lot that we haven't covered yet. And that's stuff that people should check out and read the book. There's kind of the last chapter where we figure out where to go from here, which again, I would highly encourage people to go to the book and read it. And before I go to audience Q&A, I also just want to say that the first chapter of Paul's book is on his website. So if you're curious, you could just check it out there. And I mean, some of this work is really brilliant, and already we can see some of the ramifications of it, not just kind of in our ethical lives, but very much in our political lives. And a lot of the assumptions that philosophers work with are very much questions. Like the one thing I work with, which is deliberative democracy, which assumes that we're just kind of one conversation away from resolution, doesn't work if what's at stake is a sacred value, right? Because again, they're dialectically invulnerable. So lots of brilliant stuff here. And now we can move on to audience Q&A. I see we've got sort of 13 questions. I'll try to get through as much as we can. I'll start with Yana's question. Yana says, hi, Paul. Wondering if you've engaged with the kind of social theory like Boltanski and others that focus on moral and political repertoires for justification and how people narrate and construct values. It seems like there's some overlap with your project.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And that's an area that, although I don't say too much about it in the book, I've been working on some questions that I think are right in that area. So for example, some of the stuff I've been doing since writing the book is looking at how certain kinds of constructions of value and constructions of identity can feed into this sort of fanatical stance of resentment that I was describing. So that's an area that I'm trying to explore right now, and I think hopefully it'll be fruitful. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and like we were talking about before, there's more work coming from you on many of
Yeah,
these topics, right?
that's right. Yeah, I'm continuing to work on these topics that I
Um,
address.
the second question from Josh is, how do you respond to the claim that objective rationality cannot be divorced from valuation in such a way that justification can be treated independently from sacred values to which they would be applied?
Um, so that's an interesting question. So I guess, let's see. So the idea here would be that I guess there would be a couple of different things. I'm not sure which one Josh means here, but one thing you might mean is that any standard of rationality is going to be sort of tethered to the values that you're already operating with. So we're going to define what's rational in terms of commitment to a certain set of values. So for example, if you have certain instrumental conceptions of rationality, you might think that you need to sort of specify what somebody's committed to before you can specify what's rational for that person. And then that will make trouble for certain kinds of ways of dissociating justification from the person's values. I think I think it's true that certain ways of conceiving of rationality are going to make it more difficult to define this notion of sacred values. But I guess I see that as something that's going to require certain rephrasings or different formulations of the claim, rather than something that's going to require an abandonment of the claim. So I think that any theory of rationality is going to want to admit a distinction between the values that are sort of directly responsive to the person's reflection on their rational status, and the values that to some degree resist the typical effects of that kind of justification. And then if we think of this as a spectrum, at sort of like the highest degree of resistance, you'll want to have the values that manifest that feature that I was calling dialectical invulnerability, where they're sort of completely unaffected by the agent's thoughts about whether they're justified or warranted. Now, what that means exactly, like what the agent is thinking about when they think about justification or warrant, is going to vary based on what theory of rationality they accept. So, somebody who adopts a highly internalist or instrumentalist conception of rationality will mean by that they're checking to see how these values comport with the other values that they already accept. Somebody with a more objective notion of rationality will be doing something else. They'll be appealing to some external standard. But nonetheless, I think that in both cases, we can talk about the responsiveness of the values to the justificatory questions. So I guess I think that while it would require reformulation, depending on which theory of rationality you accept, the distinction should be available within any theory of what we mean by rational justification or warrant.
I hope that answers your question, Josh. I think Kate's question relates quite nicely to dialectical invulnerability and the last chapter that we were briefly talking about. So Kate asks, you mentioned that certain values shouldn't even be questions. Do you have an account of values that can successfully withstand criticism, or of values or systems that become stronger through questioning?
Good. Yeah, that's one thing that I try to talk about a bit in the very last chapter of my book. So there are a couple of things to say about this. I don't think there's like a unique set of values that does this. So I don't think there's like one right set of values, right in the sense that they satisfy this standard. So I think there are lots of different possible sets of values that would um, be able to be sacralized in this way. Um, but I mean, I think there's some general features of the values that would be good candidates for this, for the agent to have this kind of stance with respect to them. So for example, in the last chapter of my book, I try to talk about values that it's possible to perceive as being deepened through critique and through questioning. So think about the difference between a very simple value where it seems like, you know, you're either committed to it or you're not. It's either valuable or it's not, versus a value or an ideal that where it's a little more amorphous, where it's not quite clear what the meaning of the value is or how the content of that value should be characterized, such that if you encounter one kind of objection to the value, you can always see that as an objection just to the way that the value is stated or described rather than to the value itself. Um, and I think a lot of our moral and political values are like that. So think, for example, about a value like freedom or equality or liberty or something like that. You can imagine that imagine you're committed to freedom, let's say, and imagine that you encounter all these philosophical objections to freedom, right? Questioning what the value of freedom is, what freedom even means, how it should be characterized. One thing that you can do is you might think that the criticisms that you're encountering are decisive against certain conceptions of freedom or certain descriptions of what freedom would be, while thinking that they're missing the real target, that there's still something there. Maybe you can't even articulate what it is, but you have a sense that there's something about this ideal or this value that's worth defending. There might be problems with your sort of like provisional understanding of it or your capacity to articulate what it is, but not with the value itself. So values that admit that kind of structure, where they admit a kind of deepening in your capacity to articulate what they are, I think those are the right kind of values for doing what I was describing as being capable of being objects of sacralization or devotion.
Thank you. The next question is from Brooke Maddox. I think it's a really interesting question, but they asked about you mentioning maternal devotion or
Yeah.
conjugal devotion, and they're asking if it entails a capture or control over the autonomy of a child or a partner, and do you attribute to this also some sort of psychological fragility, which is interesting because I think so far in the book we talk about kind of an attachment to values versus people. And it seems like attachment to people is almost better.
Yeah.
But I think here it seems like maybe there are cases where it could be quite problematic as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think, so I guess I wouldn't want to say that like every form of sort of trying to capture or control either the child or the romantic partner that you love would be linked to this kind of fragility. There could be other reasons, right? Like you can imagine that rather than let's say the mother in this case being psychologically fragile, maybe instead she's just like very domineering or something like that, but out of a robust sense of self. So I don't think it has to be, but I do think that that's definitely a phenomenon that happens, right? So it's definitely true that one thing that can motivate this desire to sort of not just properly relate to your child or partner, but to actually control them is a kind of fearfulness or a brittleness, a kind of psychological fragility, as I was describing it. So I definitely think that's possible and probably occurs in quite a number of cases, but not in every case where we see that effect.
And on that note, there's another question that asks if you think there's a link between fanaticism and narcissism, again, given this brittle, fragile sense of
Yeah.
self.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I haven't thought too much about narcissism, but that's a really interesting question. Let's see. I mean, it might depend a bit on how we're thinking of narcissism. I could see certain kinds of fanaticism being linked to certain kinds of narcissism, right? So, I mean, just if we think about it in a more casual sense, like one thing that, at least in my personal experience, I've often found is that people who are narcissistic sometimes do seem like deeply insecure in a certain way. Like, you know, narcissism can be a sort of cover for a kind of fearfulness or anxiety or insecurity. And you might think that that kind of fearful insecurity is linked to a defect in self, you know, a fragile sense of self. You're sort of too dependent on making people think well of you, or you know, singing your own praises and so forth in this sort of pathological way. Whereas a person who has a more stable, robust sense of their own value and who they are, they don't need to sort of like project that out into the world. They don't need to constantly be thinking about it just because it's secure for them. So I do think, I mean, again, I guess in this case, I wouldn't want to say that narcissism has to be linked to that kind of fragility. There are probably other explanations for it as well. But I think that, I mean, just thinking of people I've known, it certainly does seem like some of the more narcissistic people are ones who I at least would diagnose as having this like brittle or fragile sense of self, where the narcissism is a sort of cover for that, or a coping mechanism for that.
Really interesting. Another really interesting question from Christina. Christina's curious to learn about your views about how capitalism might play a role in breeding fanaticism. They're asking because they've observed that countries with a stronger emphasis on sacrifice in the name of capitalism display stronger kind of instances towards fanaticism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think there's going to be a complicated relationship between them, obviously. But I guess one thing, so I only gave a sort of sketch of this thing I was calling a narrative of resentment. Um, but I do think that there might be some links there between like susceptibility to these narratives and capitalist structures. I mean, again, it's going to depend in part on like what you mean by capitalism and like what features of capitalism we're focused upon. But one thing about a sort of competitive economy where your sense of worth might be tied up with the kind of striving to do better than others, or to have a kind of material level of success that others don't enjoy. When you're, you know, most people aren't going to be capable of, you know, just by definition, most people won't be capable of being better than others. So if we're both sort of taught that what it takes to be a worthwhile or valuable person is to sort of be at the heights of material success, but if we're deprived of the opportunities for actually achieving that, then you might think that there's going to be a link between that and your susceptibility to a kind of resentment. You might, you know, for example, manifest resentment toward the people who you want to blame for blocking you or preventing you from achieving that level of success. Whereas you might imagine that in a society where the grounds for self-worth are not tied up with achievement in the same way, maybe there'll be less susceptibility to these resentful reactions to others. There's not as much reason to see yourself as in opposition to them or as in competition with them. So I do think I mean, the connections would be really complicated, but I do think there might be some interesting connections there.
Again, there's a lot of kind of groundwork that's been laid here. And I think because this work is so new, a lot of people can run in different directions with some of these concepts that you've laid out. A question from Michaela is, what do you think about the propensity of social media to create an echo chamber tribalistic environment for all kinds of fanatical groups, many which are outright dangerous and hateful and radicalize people and create fanatics? And the part about the group becoming inextricably linked to a person's identity rings true, especially with social media. And then they're asking, what, if anything, can be done about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just do think it's true that social media is like a fertile ground for these things I was calling narratives of resentment. I mean, they certainly give greater reach to these narratives. More people can access them. They give us the possibility of dividing into these little subgroups that are in opposition to one another. They, as people who study these phenomena have documented the way in which they cultivate a kind of extremism, in the sense that, I mean, we all know that the most outrageous posts on social media like get the most interaction and so forth. So there are even pressures toward radicalization or extremism. So I do think that unfortunately, social media is like, it's a great ground for creating fanatics, and more generally just for promoting extremism and radicalization. Um, as to what should be done about it, I personally don't know. I mean, I think it's an unfortunate fact that we're now in an environment where it's easier for extremists to be generated. There are more pressures toward radicalization and extremism. Um, and I guess I see that as a problem that has to be dealt with, but I myself don't see any easy solutions to that. Unfortunately, so I don't have a great answer to that question. Oh, I think you're still muted.
I said we only have a few minutes. I'll end with Alice Tamimi's kind of open-ended question. Alice asks, is a life lived without devotion impoverished?
I think it is. So one of the things I try to argue in the book is precisely that. I try to argue that, I mean, you can see this in different ways. You can see it at the level of personal relationships, but you could also see it at the level of commitments to like life projects or values or causes and so forth. Um, and we could talk about it in either way. But for example, if you think that all of your relationships to like loved ones or to even just to people you care about and so forth, if they're not devoted relationships, part of what that's going to mean is that the commitment is only as stable as what you see as the grounds for, the rational grounds for maintaining it. And I think that's like a very different way of relating to people than the kind that you find, for example, in devotion, where you're sort of committed to them come what may. And I try to argue in the book that there are certain goods internal to those relationships that are only achievable by this more committed form, with this more devout form. And I think something similar is true with respect to ideals and to ways of life or life projects. There's a difference between the person who is committed to something only to the extent, where their commitment is always provisional. It will always be overturned if they come to think that there exists some objections to that thing that call it into question. There's a difference between that and the person who's like ardently devoted to the cause or to the ideal. And I try to argue in the book that without those more robust forms of devotion, we do lose out on a lot of the goods that are internal, either to relationships or to causes.